Hi, my name's Matt, and today we're going to go over how to do an oil change on a Kawasaki KLR 650. Now the manufacturer recommends that you do an oil change about every 3,000 miles. A lot of riders, myself included, like to do one earlier at about 2,000 miles to save some wear and tear on your engine. Now the reason we're going to go over how to do an oil change is because one, it'll save you money as opposed to paying a dealer or a mechanic to do it, and two, much more importantly, it'll allow you to learn your bike and know how it functions and how to fix problems. Now you don't have to be a certified mechanic or an engineer to do work on your bike. In fact, I'm neither of those. I'm simply a do-it-yourselfer who likes to think things through and references a manual. It'll take you about 30 minutes to do this procedure the first time. That's if you have to read your manual, go look for tools and think things through. After a couple of times, you should be able to change the oil in your bike in about 10 minutes. Before me is everything you're going to need to do an oil change. I highly recommend purchasing some form of manual for the bike. I purchased a Climber. There are other brands out there. They're just like a Chilton or Haynes manual for your automobile. You should also have some rags to clean up oil and other debris. I highly recommend using rubber, vinyl, or latex gloves to protect your hands from the oil. You're going to need either a ratchet or a wrench set. In this case, a 17mm and an 8mm socket will do. As far as oil, there are several different weights you can run in the KLR. I go with the 1040, and I make no specific recommendation as far as brand. In this case, I have Castrol GTX. Make your own decision about brand and oil type. You're going to need an oil filter. Every other oil change, you're going to change the filter. And finally, you need an oil drip pan or some similar device to catch the old oil. Now the bike and your oil need to be warm before you start the change. I haven't ridden this bike at any time in the last hour, so instead I'm going to fire it up and let it run for about 5 minutes. It's been about 5 minutes, and now my bike is up to operating temperature, so now we're ready to do the oil change. Something to remember as we go about here is that your exhaust, the oil, and your engine are all now hot. So pay particular attention to getting your hands around this exhaust pipe, and also once we undo the plug screw here, the oil itself is going to be very hot also. Now that the bike is warmed up, the next step in the oil change is to remove the drain plug. The drain plug is located at the very center bottom of your bike, right here. If you have a skid plate like I do, that plug might be a little hard to access. Make sure you do not use a crescent wrench on this. Use either a 17mm box end wrench or, like I am, a 17mm ratchet. This drain plug is on kind of snug, so watch out you don't skin your knuckles as you undo it. Once you've cracked that drain plug with your ratchet or your box and wrench, go ahead and set it off to the side, and you can move your oil drip pan into position now. You can just use your fingers and continue to unthread that drain plug. Keep control of it though, because once it comes out of those threads, it's going to want to fall down into your drip pan. So if you can control it with your fingers, you can prevent it getting all dirty with the oil. Now oil is going to run over your fingers, and it's probably going to be a little bit warm. That's why I recommend using the vinyl gloves. Now it's going to take a minute or two or three for that oil to drain out. So what I do is I take one of my rags, kind of clean off my rubber gloves, just so I don't get everything else oily. Then also you want to take your oil plug right here and just wipe the excess oil off of it. Once that's done, set it off to the side along with your rag. You want to reach up here and undo the cap. This will allow air to enter the clutch side of your engine, and you get the rest of your oil out. Now as the oil drains out, what you're going to have to do is move the bike to level. Since I have not used jack stands or a bike lift, I simply pull it level towards me. Be careful when you do this, because the bike, if it becomes unbalanced, can fall on you. You notice that every time I take the bike to level and back down, a little more oil comes out. So I'll do that a few times, and then I'll walk away for a minute or two and let the oil continue to drain. Now as the oil finish is coming out, what we want to do is make sure that our oil filter cap right here is off. So now I've switched my 17 mil socket for an 8 mil, and I'm going to remove these two bolts right here. Now this oil filter cap is set in very snugly and with a low clearance to its housing, which means that you don't want to torque it as you pull it out. There's a tab here to the lower right of the cap that allows you to pry, but it's not a good idea to stick a screwdriver or a prying tool of another form in there, because if you pull too hard, you may damage the aluminum housing of the cap. So pull it out nice and evenly, set it off to the side, and you'll see the oil filter behind it. And now we can verify there's no more oil in our oil pan. And we do this by pulling the bike level and setting it back down again. There may be a small stream of oil to come out, but nothing significant. So now we've verified there's no more oil in the pan. Okay, now we have the oil out of the bike and we have the oil filter cap removed. The next step is to change out that filter. There's a filter mounting pin, which is this silver cylinder right here, this dowel, and it needs to come out along with the filter. It's kind of hard to pull these guys out because there's oil, which obviously makes things slick. And so one technique is to take one of the bolts from the filter cap and gently use it to pull out that cylinder. Then you can tip the cylinder at an angle and pull both it and the filter out. Now it's going to be a little bit messy because oil is going to come out with it, so I just guide the filter down to over the drip pan, remove the mounting pin. And at this point you need to be very careful to remember the orientation that the mounting pin and the filter are within this housing. As I remove it, you can see that the end of that cylinder has got a smaller diameter, like an indentation almost. That needs to go in the same direction when you replace the filter. The small diameter needs to fit into that small hole in the very back of the oil filter housing. So I will set the mounting pin off to the side. And now to dispose of this dirty oily filter, what I usually do is simply put it inside the new filters box and then wrap that with one of my gloves. And I'll just go ahead and do a glove change right then. So now you have that messy filter all contained. And I will change out my gloves. Now that we have the old filter removed, we're going to get rid of some of that old oil that's inside the filter housing. So take a clean rag, a new rag that doesn't have any dirt on it, and just kind of mop up, soak up some of that old oil that's in the filter housing. The next step is you need to check the oil bypass valve. The oil bypass valve sits at the narrow end of the mounting pin for the oil filter. You can see the two holes here. The hole that's closest to the narrow end, the narrow diameter of the mounting pin, has the oil bypass valve in it. It's spring loaded, so if you take one of the mounting bolts from the oil filter cap and stick it inside gently and just kind of push down a little bit, you can feel that spring action and you can see the oil bypass filter opening up there in that hole. Just verify that it's working. Once you verify the oil bypass filter is working, the next step is to install the new oil filter. So take your oil filter, take just a little bit of the old oil, and make sure these rubber grommets at either end are lubricated with a little bit of that old oil. Next, take your mounting pin, ensuring the proper orientation, which is this narrow diameter of the pin is going to point towards the back of the engine. Again, you can see the indentation, the hole that it's going to go into in the back. So stick it through the filter, making sure that these rubber grommets are resting on the large diameter portion of the pin. Then place the filter inside. And you'll need to move it around with your fingers until that mounting pin seats fully into its recess in the back. Once you've done that, you can take the oil filter cap and place it over the new filter. Now there's an arrow on the top here that lines up, tells you this is the up direction. You can also match the tab that's on the oil filter cap with this little tab on the engine body, and obviously you can line up the mounting holes. Take the 2 bolts, finger thread them in. It's a good idea to use Loctite on most every bolt on the KLR. I don't use it on these oil caps, oil filter caps. I've never had a problem. I'm not saying you won't. Now it's really important as you tighten these oil filter cap bolts to do it evenly. It's kind of like lug nuts on a tire. You want to make sure that that cap does not get torqued to either side, thus damaging either it or the engine body. Now these bolts don't take much force. You definitely don't want to reef down on these guys. Just hand tight. Okay, now we have the new filter in. Now that we've switched out the old oil filter and put a new filter in, the next step is to replace the oil drain plug back from whence it came. Some recommend that you put a brass or another crushable, malleable washer in here for a seal. I've never had a problem with it leaking, so I haven't been doing that. Just take that oil drain plug and thread it into its hole and try to get it finger tight, which can be a little bit awkward with these skid plates. Now that I have it finger tight, take my ratchet and I switch from my 8mm socket back to my 17mm socket, and I hand tight using the ratchet. Make sure I got a good grip on the bolt, and like I said, just hand tight. 17 foot-pounds is the value that that drain bolt is supposed to be torqued to. It's pretty important that you don't really snug it down because you don't want to strip out those threads. Okay, we've removed the old oil from the bike. We've changed out the old oil filter with a new one. We've made sure that we replaced the oil filter cap, and I'm going to double check that we did in fact replace the oil pan plug, and it's there. One of the last steps is to replace the old oil with new oil. The bike holds 2.5 liters of oil, but if you don't replace the oil filter like you often do every other oil change, you're only going to put in 2 liters of oil. Since I have in fact replaced an oil filter, I'm shooting for 2.5 liters of oil. So the way we do this is put 2 quick quarts of oil in. You can use a funnel if you'd like. I've never really found the need to, given that the oil fill port is so easily accessed on the KLR. So I finished with the first quart of oil. And I'll quickly put in a second quart of oil. Again, I don't recommend any specific brand or type of oil. I simply use the weight. I use a name brand of oil, and I use the weight as recommended by the Kawasaki manual or a similar like a climber's manual. I've been using 1040. My clutch shifts just fine, and she starts okay. Alright, now that I have 2 quarts of oil in the bike, we're going to check our oil level. The way you do that on a bike is different than a car. Bikes don't have dipsticks for the oils. Instead, you have a sight glass right down here. Very common on motorcycles. The sight glass shows the level of oil in the bike. There's two lines, an upper and a lower, representing the minimum amount of oil you want in your bike and the maximum amount of oil you want in your bike. So now that I've added 2 quarts, what I'm going to do is pull the bike level again. This time, I'm checking that sight glass to see where the oil ends up. Right now it's up the upper level, and we're going to start the bike up and shut it down again, which will circulate oil through the engine, and that level's probably going to drop. We've added more oil into the engine, and so now the next step is to let the oil circulate through the engine so we get the proper oil level. Critical that you do not run the engine with the oil cap off. You will lose your oil and make a mess. So I replace the oil cap, hand snug. I do a quick little double check. Make sure there is oil. Yep, there is some oil in the bike before I start it up. Now what I'm going to do is start the bike and let it run for about a minute just so that oil can circulate throughout the engine. I'll let the bike run for about a minute, and so now I'm going to double check my oil level now that it's distributed throughout the engine. So again, I pull the bike level, give it a couple seconds for the oil to sort itself out, and you can see now that my oil level is just down a little bit, not too much. So what we're going to do is open up my 3rd quart of oil and just put a little bit of oil in until we bring that oil to the top of the sight glass. So I'll undo my oil cap, open up my 3rd quart of oil, and I'm just going to guesstimate a few ounces of oil out of this. Give that oil a few seconds to make its way down into the pan. I'm going to close my cap just so I don't forget it. Now I pull the bike level again and check my oil level. Looks pretty good to me. It's right there at the top line. And so I would consider my oil change complete. The only other thing you want to do at this point is the next time you run your bike, you want to double check that oil level. And it's also just a good practice to every time you get gas, anytime you really think about it, look down and check that oil. Just like a car, it's the most important thing on your bike as far as maintenance goes. Well, that wraps it up for this oil change. I'm Matt, this is my KLR, and I hope that this video has helped you see that you're able to do your own maintenance.